his own top aide, a military veteran and harsh right-wing super conservative, that's a fair description of John Kelly, is yoking Donald Trump to Hitler. This is as serious as it gets. General Kelly, you might remember, is a four-star general. He's dealt with Homeland Security, he's dealt with wars and military matters, and he served as Trump's chief of staff. He has decided to speak out. We've discussed as a nation, as a society, who and speaks out and when and how far they're willing to go. He is concerned that Donald Trump will take his admiration for Hitler and his vows to abuse power and destroy America as a constitutional republic as we know it. That's what he's concerned about. The general has become a whistleblower. This is a big deal. He's concerned that Trump is a, quote, fascist. He's concerned that Trump denigrates military and its service members. He believes Trump will do what he has already vowed to do, the talk of being a dictator, of abusing power, of abusing military powers, of using violence against people in this country, of treating people who disagree with him, politically or otherwise, as an enemy. And what do you do with enemies? I think we know. Kelly is doing this now for a reason, and he's doing it on tape in recorded, serious, long-form interviews with the New York Times, and it is making huge waves in the campaign. I showed you Kamala Harris speaking out about this as a new and serious thing. And so as a newscaster in these important times, I'm going to, as I said, give you the news. The only thing I'll add is that this is serious. It's about the choices we face as a nation. It's not about whether people say Trump gets away with things or how new is this compared to what people already thought about him. It's brand new. It involves Hitler. And we begin, in Kelly's own words, with the kind of rebuke that has obviously rung alarm bells, even for people who might agree with Donald Trump on certain things.
He commented more than once that, that Hitler did some good things too. And of course, if you know history, again, I think he's lacking in that. But if you know what Hitler was all about, it'd be pretty hard to make an argument that he did anything good.
What would he say when you would lay that out to him?
He just, that'd be the end of the conversation usually.
That's John Kelly, four-star general, in the room one-on-one with then-President Trump. And he's not alone. The Atlantic has a big report that Trump said what he wanted was total loyalty, personal, not to the Constitution, but personal loyalty to him from his generals. Quote, Trump reportedly saying, I need the kind of generals that Hitler had. People who were totally loyal to him, that follow orders. Two sources to the Atlantic. Vice President Harris making a break from the planned rallies, and some of them more upbeat, as we've shown you, to deal with this. Again, she's a sitting vice president. This guy's running for president against her. She took a break from those sort of scheduled, more upbeat rallies and GOTV events to mark this moment right now, to denounce Donald Trump.
Donald Trump's former chief of staff, John Kelly, a retired four-star general, confirmed that while Donald Trump was president, he said he wanted generals like Adolf Hitler had. Donald Trump said that because he does not want a military that is loyal to the United States Constitution. He wants a military that is loyal to him. He wants a military who will be loyal to him personally. In just the past week, Donald Trump has repeatedly called his fellow Americans the enemy from within, and even said that he would use the United States military to go after American citizens. And let's be clear about who he considers to be the enemy from within. Anyone who refuses to bend a knee or dares to criticize him would qualify.
Strong statement from the vice president. This came up in the New York Times interview, where when asked whether Trump is basically a fascist, as others have warned, including General Milley, Kelly referred to the definition.
Do you think he's a fascist?
Well, I'm looking at the definition of fascism. It's a far-right, authoritarian, ultra-nationalist political ideology and movement characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, belief in a natural social hierarchy. So certainly, in my experience, those are the kind of things that he thinks would work better in terms of running America. But certainly, the former president is in the far right area. He's certainly an authoritarian. Admires people who are dictators. He has said that. So he certainly falls into the general definition of fascist, for sure.
That's John Kelly on the record, meaning this is him saying these things to the New York Times on tape. We know it's him. That carries a lot of weight. In journalism, it's different than what they call a blind quote. The other article making waves this week had two unnamed sources for the other Hitler material. Now, if you want to speculate, you could say maybe they're two different people. Maybe one of them includes Kelly, who's told a similar anecdote. But these are sources piling up. We are also clearly want to report that Donald Trump's team is denying this. They're saying he did not praise Hitler. They're saying he doesn't subscribe to fascism. He also could come out and speak to this. He could say he's horrified by these comments. He could say what really most politicians in America, in either party, would have ever done. He's not exactly acting like that. So I have to report the denial while also say that he's not exactly going out and saying this is somehow the worst thing ever, in his view, in public. I mentioned General Mark Milley, four-star, who rose to the level of chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he had said to Bob Woodward, we reported on this at the time, no one's ever been as dangerous to the country as Trump. I realize now he's a total fascist. He's the most dangerous person to the country. In addition to Trump's sort of on-record sort of, oh, hey, we deny it, you have other things he said recently that overlap with this. He has not specifically praised Hitler in public. Maybe he knows that's not a good October closing message. But he's openly said he wants to be a dictator for day one. He's talked about using violence illegally and on the home front and against Americans. And he's vowed a type of illegal political retribution that would create the kind of constitutional crises where the president asks for something unlawful, and then you have to see who at DOJ, FBI, or in the military is willing to find ways to stand up, stop, blow the whistle, or who sort of goes along with it to some degree. You can go back to 2022, early in the preparations for this campaign, when NPR counted up that Trump had actually made over 100 threats to investigate, prosecute, imprison, or otherwise punish and attack his enemies. And if you want to analyze that, you can explain that in a couple of ways. Number one, he's saying what he wants to do. In journalism and telling stories, that's one of the main ways we understand something. If someone says, I promise to raise taxes or lower them, I promise to attack my political enemies through the government, or I promise not to do that, sometimes it is what it is, and that's one way to understand it. The second is with the endless rigging of the democracy and government system itself. It's something we've reported on here extensively. I've shown you the way the coup plot worked. Rachel Maddow and others have done great and extensive reporting on this very issue, and it's designed to do something even before he gets into office, to scare, intimidate, to silence critics. And there are some people, particularly, say, in journalism or in the watchdog agency of a government entity, that are very familiar with those efforts, and if the system works, they're supposed to keep going and not be cowed. But there's a heck of a lot of other people, say a random volunteer elections worker, or someone just doing a job at a business, who are going to look at that, and if they are not committed to avoiding that kind of risk or threat, or they haven't thought it all the way through, or they're just scared, it may work on them. So that's number two, the rigging, the use of all this to affect things. And then there's number three, the signaling. Separate from what Donald Trump will do himself, it's a signaling to his party and anyone doing business with him in any way, politically or otherwise, this is what we're going to do. John Kelly, in these interviews, also says Trump just preferred a, quote, dictator approach, saying he never accepted the fact that he was not the most powerful man in the world. And by power, I mean an ability to do anything he wanted, anytime he wanted. That matters because Kelly is describing Trump 1.0 with guardrails and an election that he lost. He famously and infamously and potentially criminally tried to overthrow that election, but that was the guardrail. He attacked the peaceful transfer of power and lost again. He lost the election, he lost the coup effort, and was shown the door. Kelly, who knows better than almost anyone what Trump was like behind closed doors, the orders he issued, the things he wanted to get done, is warning it will be worse next time. So I'm reporting to you what Kelly is saying, and you can decide, and the country can decide how to weigh that in their decision in this election. Here was Kelly as well on the Constitution.
He's certainly the only president that has all but rejected what America is all about and what makes America America in terms of our Constitution, in terms of our values.
Did the former president appreciate the Constitution? Did he appreciate any of these things?
No. An awful lot of people break the law and expect subordinates to break the law or to circumvent the law somehow. And that's where he was coming from.
When he was confronted with the fact that he couldn't do something legally, did he want to do it anyway?
He would try to make the case that he did have the authority.
It's really damning. We use these words, whistleblower, warning, alert. This is that. It is new from John Kelly. It is not old news. It is worse than many of the things we've heard about Donald Trump, including the direct positive reference to Adolf Hitler. It is not more of the same. One sign that it may matter is how a lot of Trump allies are furiously trying to distract from or lie about this today. We're going to deal with the facts of it, and people can weigh it against the other things they're considering as they make their decisions in these final 13 days. And for this potentially important conversation, we are joined by someone who, like John Kelly, has risked his life and served the country and knows something about the military and its obligation not to any one person, even the president, but to the rule of law and the Constitution of this nation.